Hi everybody, welcome back. We're going to continue with the course How to Study. In the last lesson we were looking at advanced cramming, so we're going to continue with a couple of new topics. The first is going to be how to do proper note taking, and you can actually apply this for taking notes in class during lesson time or for your revision, and we're going to be looking at, of course, how to do it for revision. And another topic we're going to look at is what is encoding. So this is going to be a very important topic because it deals with a little bit of the, I suppose, the science behind how we study, how we maintain information, and how we recall information later. So there are certain ways that students, and indeed everybody, when they're learning something new, there's certain ways of studying and remembering things which are better than others. So we're going to look at some of the higher order learning ways of doing this, and there's going to be quite a bit of material to get through in today's class, so we're going to get stuck straight into it, and we're going to jump into our handout again. Okay, so we're back with the long study session, and this is the area we were looking at last time, the sort of preview of what's coming up, the advanced cramming. We'll be looking at targeted review later in another lesson, so we're going to be looking at this second part here. So we're kind of working our way backwards. Consolidation and preparation. Okay, so that's going to be the new area for today. As I said before, this is kind of like thinking about the past, the present, and the future. So the past is targeted review, looking over stuff that you've already done, testing yourself, testing your recall, using things like flashcards or doing maybe past paper questions or something. And number two is the present, so going over stuff you've just learnt for the first time or you've just come across for the first time. And then preview is the future, looking over at stuff that's coming down the line. So let's get stuck into today's consolidation and preparation. You can see here that there are going to be sort of two areas to this. One is what we're looking at today, note taking, but there'll also be mind maps in another lesson. So we'll just leave mind maps and how to do mind maps for future lesson, and we'll just go over here to note taking. So yeah guys, typical study time when you cover new topics, this is what most students would consider revision. They don't really think so much about the past papers or the flashcards for the testing part, and they don't really think much about preview of what's coming up. Most students, when they think of revision, it's sitting down with your notes, summarizing them and going over them and trying to memorize or understand them. And it's not the greatest sort of approach. I'm going to show you guys a couple of things to watch out for. If you catch yourself doing this, then stop and adopt some of the new techniques that we're going to look at today. So typical study time when you cover new topics that have been given to you since previous study sessions. And we're going to use this thing called SQ3R. And I know there's an updated version of this like SQ4R, but to me this is still hasn't really changed that much, and this is still the better version as far as I can tell. This is the one that most students seem to respond to better. So SQ3R, when taking notes and making them non-linear and multi-order. Okay, there's a lot of jargon in that. What do we mean by SQ3R? What do we mean by non-linear and multi-order? So for SQ3R, well, SQ, survey, question, and then the 3 R's, read, recite, and review. And we're going to go into each of those in a wee bit of detail as well. So when you're doing your notes, try to get out of the habit of doing your revision notes in a linear format. So you're starting at the top of the page, and then you're just writing a small paragraph, and then maybe bullet points, and that's a linear way of doing your notes from top to bottom, one side to the other, from one side to the other, one side of the page to the other. Try to get out of the habit of doing that so that you're actually doing your class notes almost like a mind map. Okay, so you start maybe with a central topic or a central idea or several central ideas, and then have branches coming off them, subtopics, and then maybe subtopics coming off them. So having a main idea and the definitions of it and things that are related to it, and then having other things coming off of them, so it looks like a mind map or maybe a spider diagram or something. So yeah, you want to make your revision notes non-linear and also multi-order, so there's like a hierarchy to it as well. You'll have a central idea, main theme, maybe then central topics around that, and then subtopics around each of those topics. So yeah, you want to sort of get into the habit of doing that with your normal class notes, and then it makes it 1,000 times easier to transfer that into mind maps for future revision and study. So yeah, that's what we mean by non-linear and multi-order. And so anything that sort of can't be covered into a mind map, you can of course create flashcards for that. But as it says here, anything that can't be put into a mind map at all, that should be very little, guys, unless it's a completely isolated piece of information that doesn't really relate to 99.9% of everything else in your set works, or, you know, whatever you're studying. It should be very little. Nearly everything should be able to be made into a mind map, should be included in a mind map somehow. But just say, for example, there is something, if it can't be grouped with other information, that will become a flashcard. Okay, so if we just look over here, so you can see here, this would be your typical class notes if you have done them in a linear format. Try to make it a bit more looking like a mind map. But say that you are quite traditional in your note taking and you just start at the top of your A4 page and you write loads of paragraphs and bullet points and everything. You're going to take information out of this and put it into a mind map, okay, using efficient encoding. So we'll look at encoding later. And the stuff that can't be created into mind maps, that's going to become flashcards for future study. And it doesn't have to be even class notes like this, guys. For music, the subject that I teach for GCSE, AS and A2 music, this could instead be your musical score with all those musical features written in by you or by your teacher. And you're going to take some of them out, or most of them out, and make mind maps out of them, and take the ones that can't be made into mind maps and transfer them over to flashcards. As I say, that should be very, very little, if anything at all. I would go so far as to say you should be able to make everything into a mind map, because information, as we said before, does not like to be isolated. It makes it so much easier to remember things if it's connected to other pieces of information. Maybe the only thing I can think of for music that would be like that would be perhaps background information to the set work. You know, when it was composed, who it was dedicated to, maybe a little bit of what it's related to outside of the set work, what other pieces by the composer are similar to this, little things like that. But even then, you could probably include those into a mind map in some ways. So if you find, though, that there is anything that is completely isolated, try really hard to make it connect to other pieces of information, because it's going to make it so much easier to remember. The last thing you want, guys, when you're doing your revision, especially for GCSE, is you do not want like 200 flashcards for each set work. Times that by 10 or 11, you're going to be ending up with thousands of flashcards. And that's just for music. And then, you know, you have another 10 subjects to study. It's going to be so much work for so little return. And you have to keep going over them and over them and over them. Otherwise, you'll forget the information. So that's why I kind of try to, you know, steer students away from flashcards, because they kind of over rely on them. At the most, I would say, guys, if you're doing like GCSE, you should have at the most like 30 or 40 flashcards for all 11 set works. And the same for A level, for AS or A2, 40, 50 flashcards for all 12 set works. Okay, if you find you've gone to like 100 flashcards for one set work, try to imagine, you know, what your study is going to be like in the future, where you have to go over hundreds, if not a couple of thousand flashcards for all your A levels, and just keep going over them and over them and over them. It's going to make your revision extremely boring, tedious and stressful. What happens if you keep forgetting the information? Flashcards don't really help you remember things that way. They're great for testing and they're great for recall, don't get me wrong. I don't really see flashcards as your revision. I see that as testing what you revised. Okay, so that you do need some sort of test, some sort of recall, of course, but leave that for flashcards after you've done your actual mind maps and revising, and then test your ability to remember the information. They're good for that. But they're not good on their own just for revising. Don't take all your class notes and just go to Quizlet or Anki and just make them all into flashcards, because anyone who's done that will tell you that it requires a lot of time going over them, but also a lot of time creating them as well. So you don't want to fall into that trap, guys. Yeah, so we will look at encoding in a minute or so, but for now, just be aware that, you know, flashcards should be quite rare. It's not 50-50. You don't have half your information going into mind maps and the other half going into flashcards. You know, you're talking about 99.9% mind maps and 0.1% flashcards, if even that. Okay, so getting back to SQ3R, survey, question, read, recite, review. So when you survey something, you should skim or scan through a chapter or music, a set work, and write down the main headings, subheadings, any figures or tables or marginal information, the information in the margins, summary paragraphs, any of the big sort of things, the big picture ideas in your chapter or indeed in your set work. So for things like music, this could be, what's the structure of the piece? What are the main themes of the piece? What are the instruments involved in the performance or the voices involved in the performance? And what's the genre of the work? Is it a symphony, a concerto? Is it from an opera, an oratorio? What features in the music give that away? So it's like the big ideas that, it's not the detail, it's the big things that make up the actual set work. And then all the detailed information will come later. So you need the sort of, foundation, the scaffolding, I suppose, of the set work before you start getting into figuring out what all the little minor details of the set work are going to be. It's the equivalent of building a house. You get the foundations correct, you get the structure and the walls and the roof and everything on. And you don't want to be going into the details, which is like thinking about where all the furniture is going to go. All the little ornaments and everything for every room. That comes later. Okay, so surveying is the first thing that you should do with every set work, and it shouldn't take you too long, okay, because it's only like the main ideas. You're talking a couple of paragraphs of summary here. So don't read the chapter, okay, so you don't go through the entire chapter, or in the case of music, don't go through the entire set work bar by bar. Only what stands out, so the big ideas. What takes up the most space? What is repeated, or things that keep coming back, or things that are highlighted? And we'll look at that also when we're going into encoding, the type of questions to ask yourself. So what are the big things for a set work in GCSE or A level? And for me, they're the same things every single time. So number one, anything or any ideas that happen over a long period of time. So some maybe ostinato or repeated pattern or something in the background, even if it's a drone or something, or a chord progression or a melodic idea or some sort of accompaniment pattern that keeps happening, goes over like 10-20 bars, or it maybe takes like half a minute to get through. That's a big thing. It isn't like a little tiny detail that's occurring in one bar and then it's gone. So something that happens over a long period of time in your set work. Number two, anything that keeps coming back. So it mightn't be repeated over and over again like an ostinato pattern, or happen over a long period of time like a chord progression, but it could be like an idea, maybe like a cadence or a particular orchestral effect or something that happens once, then it goes away, but then it comes back again later. It's restated, not repeated, but it's restated later on, and then it goes away again, and then something else comes in, and then it comes back again. So anything that keeps coming back is obviously going to be a really important thing to watch out for. Number three, one-off dramatic changes. So maybe halfway through the piece, there's a sudden change of key, maybe there's a sudden change of tempo, maybe new instruments are brought in or other instruments drop out, and a sudden change in dynamic level. So change of tempo, key, dynamic level, instruments, and all these things could happen at once, and it suddenly changes the direction or the atmosphere or the mood of the piece, and it makes it go off in a completely different direction. That's a one-off dramatic change. That should be something that stands out and is very simple to hear and also to write about. And number four, in terms of what are the most important things to look out for, the structure of the piece. So maybe changes of key, maybe cadences that indicate the end of a section or the beginning of a new section or the beginning of a new phrase. Maybe new motifs or new themes are brought in, or maybe new instruments are brought in, new sections of the orchestra are brought in, and other sections are dropping out. So any sort of structural things like that you should be looking out for as well. So think of that like doing a jigsaw puzzle. You always start at the borders and work your way in. It's the same when you're doing your revision. If you do your revision for each set work or whatever you're revising for any subject, if you start with the biggest ideas first and work inwards into the detail, you'll find that it's much easier for your brain to memorize and handle all the information, rather than starting on the bar by bar. Start at the beginning and work your way through it, and everything has equal importance and everything is just leading on from one thing to the next. That's really, really hard and difficult to understand and organize and memorize that information. So those four things, guys, are what you should be looking out for your revision for each set work. Anything that happens over a long period of time, anything that keeps coming back, any dramatic one-off changes, and number 4 would be structural things. As I said, don't take too much time with this. 5-10 minutes per set work is enough. So it's something you would do. You could do it regularly though, 5 or 10 minutes for the first time you come across the set work, then try doing it again a few weeks or months later just to sort of see if there's anything that you missed before. So don't just do it as a one-off, do it a couple of times just to make sure you get the big picture out of the way. The next thing then is to make your own questions, generate questions from this. So once you've done your survey, generate questions about the survey. So convert all those headings into questions. So for example, if you were doing, say, Andal for GCSE, there's a piece called For Unto Us a Child is Born. That's the piece that you guys do for GCSE if you're doing the Northern Ireland board, the CCEA board. And you might find that there isn't a particular structure to this piece. It may not be like binary form or sonata form or anything, but you may notice that there are particular themes to watch out for. So for example, there are 5 main ideas. Well, there's theme A, theme B1, theme B2, and theme C, theme D, theme E. Okay, so it's really sort of 6 ideas, I suppose. But you may want to sort of ask yourself the question, how are these themes related? Okay, so that could be a question that you mightn't answer right away, and you mightn't know the answer, but are all of them completely different? Do they have any relationship to each other? Or, as so often what happens in music, one idea is sort of born out of another idea. It's generated from one idea. So you may want to see if you can find similarities between one theme and another theme. So it may not be like a textbook where you have, individual headings for each section. In music, it tends to be more going through the score and finding the main musical features. So if you've done the survey part, you should be able to find these quite easily. So all you need to do is think of potential questions that are usually asked in an exam situation, like what are the main musical features of theme A? Or who sings theme A for the first time? Or who plays theme A for the first time? Or what key is theme B in? And how do we get from theme B to theme C? What is the relationship between them? So it should be relatively straightforward to do that, to get questions generated out of your survey of what you've done in your survey. Yeah, so the 2 things that I always tell students to do for every set work is do an evaluation and do an analysis. So we are going to go into that in a little bit more detail when we come to encoding. So what do we mean by evaluation? What do we mean by analysis? We've kind of already touched on this, guys, when we talked about, the big ideas, the big things that stand out. That's kind of your evaluation. You're making a judgment call about what are the most important topics in your set work. As I say, this could be for any subject, any revision at all. Don't just think it's only for music. I'm only giving you guys a little bit of a taste of the music side of things because that's what I teach. So you can, of course, do this for any subject you're studying. Ask yourself, what are the big topics and why? List them in order of importance, in order of priority. You're making a judgment call, you're evaluating them. Okay, so analysis, what are the similarities and differences, or compare and contrast is the other way of thinking of it, between these main ideas. So what are the similarities and differences between them? Once you know what the important topics are, how are they related to each other? What's the differences and similarities? And what questions are these topics and headings trying to answer? This is where maybe having a little look at past papers just to get an idea of the question types that are asked, not necessarily to do the past papers, but just to get an idea of the question types and to have maybe those questions listed, like make a list of the typical type of questions that are asked in your exam. And as you're going through, you're making your notes, making your class notes or revision notes, try to always keep those questions, in the background of your mind, or even put them up on a piece of paper and stick it to your wall so it's nearby. You can always look up and glimpse what the questions are. So your revision should always be relevant to what you're going to be asked. What are the questions these topics headings are trying to answer? Okay, so that's survey and questions. The next thing then is read. Number 1, the first of our 3 R's: read, recite, review. This is going to be the read part. Now this is where your actual, putting pen to paper and doing your hours and hours of study. This is where it all really sort of starts. Now you're going to read through the material in detail because you've only surveyed it and then made questions based on that survey. Now you're actually going to go into it in detail, answering the questions that you've already asked yourself in the second step, answering those questions by rephrasing and reorganizing that information into mind maps. And we're going to look at how to do mind maps in another lesson, but this is where you would have it in the steps that we're looking at today. It'd be step number 3. As you're going through your textbooks, or in the case of music, as you're going through your set works, always read through them in detail with a clear purpose. When you get to this step, always have a clear purpose in mind. As you're going through it, remember the questions that you could be asked in your exam. If you've made a list of those questions and you have those questions stuck to the wall in front of you, always ask yourself, how are you going to answer these questions? Okay, and how can you find the answers in the set work that you have in front of you, or the textbook you have in front of you? So always read with a clear purpose to, first of all, answer typical exam questions, and also how can you group similar information together, and that's known as chunking. You're probably already familiar with that, guys, when it comes to chunking, when it comes to like giving your telephone number. You sort of split it up into little bite-sized chunks to make it more memorable. It's the same thing when it comes to grouping your information together in your revision. We'll obviously be going through a lot of examples of these at the end of the course. We'll go through some of the set works for each area, for GCSE, for AS, and for A2. So I will show you guys how to do all this, but this is what you need to be thinking about in step 3 when you're doing your detailed reading and making it into mind maps. Also, maybe think about what is entirely new information. Okay, what is stuff that you've not come across before? That's also reading with a clear purpose as well. You're trying to think about questions for the exam and trying to think about how to answer them. You're also trying to think about how you can group similar information together, but also think about, well, what should I maybe highlight as this is the first time I've come across this and it's entirely new. And maybe if I'm not too sure about it, it could be something I could ask my teacher about. Or maybe what you're studying is related to other prior information. So you can see how this is beginning to sound very much like what we were looking at in the last video when it came to advanced cramming, except you were doing this for topics you haven't covered yet. So it's very similar. All this stuff is kind of all interrelated and all happening simultaneously as you're revising. And then, of course, test yourself every paragraph and every page. What have I just read? So continuously do that at the end of each section, or maybe the end of the paragraph, the end of the page. See, can you recall what you're actually reading and what you've made notes on? And that takes us nicely into the 4th part here, guys, the reciting. So you've done the surveys, you've done the questions, you've done the reading, and now you're going to recite this information. Recall from memory what you've just read or learned in your own words. What were the headings and subheadings and, tables and paragraphs and summary paragraphs and main musical features and the big topics and everything? And can you answer those questions? And the last part here, guys, do a review. Do a self-analysis on your recall performance. What do you keep forgetting? Or what was hard to remember? So what needs to change? What works and what doesn't? I suppose the what doesn't is the more important one, because you do need to obviously tweak that over time. Refine your work. And repeat this process using spaced repetition, which we will look at in another video when we talk about active recall and spaced repetition. Okay, so that sort of leads us into another topic, recall and spaced repetition. So just to summarize then, guys, for SQ3R, survey, do a quick survey of any chapter of a textbook or your first set work. Spend about 5 to 10 minutes going through it, asking yourself the big questions. What keeps happening over a long period of time? What keeps coming back, restating throughout the set work? What are the big dramatic changes? So one-off changes in the set work. And what are the main structural points of the set work? Things like changes of key, important cadences, the introduction of new themes, motifs, instruments that drop in or drop out, sections that drop in or drop out. So it should take 5 or 10 minutes if you go through the set work, just looking out for those big things. And not all of them are going to be there. Some of the set works, in fact, are going to be completely vocal, a cappella singing with no instruments, and they're all singing the whole way through. So obviously things like what instruments come in and out is not going to be applicable. And then the second thing then is you're going to create your own questions based on the survey. Form your own questions and try to, look up past papers and make those questions as similar to the type of questions that you normally are asked and that you're going to be asked in the exam. Okay, so obviously try to make it as relevant and as applicable to the exam as possible. And then for your 3 R's, your read, recite, review. Read into detail, go through the set work or go through the chapter in your textbook, whatever it is you're revising, and pull out all the main details and create a mind map from them. You're answering the questions that you have asked yourself in the second stage when you're forming your own questions on the set work. Can you answer those questions now? And ask yourself, how can you create mind maps from this? How can you group similar information together, chunking? What is entirely new information, or what's related to stuff you've already learned in the past, your prior knowledge? And also test yourself every paragraph or every 30 seconds of the set work. What have I just read or what have I just listened to? So always read or go into the revision detail with a clear purpose. Then reciting is recalling all that information from memory. Can you remember the main topics from your surveys? Can you remember the questions that you asked yourself? And can you think of the answers to those questions? And then the last R is the review. Okay, go through your revision process, all the previous steps, and what has been working. What information are you remembering well? What information are you not remembering? So what is working and what isn't working, and what do you need to change? Okay guys, so that is our note taking, our typical study time when you cover new topics. As I say, you can do this in class as well as revision. I would highly recommend you do this in class as well, because it makes your revision so much easier. So as I say, we do need to also look at encoding, because we kind of covered 2 areas of encoding already when we were talking about this evaluating and analysis. So I just want to go into a little bit more detail as well when it comes to encoding, because this is where students often misinformation or misunderstand information or can't remember information, or they often fall into the trap of just trying to memorize the revision. So we're going to see what do we mean by encoding and what to look out for, and some of the pitfalls when it comes to studying. So the very first thing we need to ask, what is encoding? Okay guys, so to sort of break it down very generally, encoding is when you're just transferring information from short-term to long-term memory. That's really all that we're talking about. So encoding should be strong. So if you're going to do encoding and moving information from short-term into long-term memory, you need to have a strong approach to do this. In order that you don't have to keep retrieving the information, this is what happens when you use flashcards or overuse flashcards. You're kind of relying on going over your flashcards again and again and again and again to retrieve that information, because that's the only way you're going to remember it. Any of you who've done flashcard revision before will know that if you stop it for like a week or 2 or a month, you've probably forgotten nearly everything that you've written down in the flashcards. So that's what we mean by trying to avoid always having to retrieve the information to remember it. So if you've encoded the information well through using mind maps, if you've done really strong encoding, you don't have to keep retrieving the information to remember it, because you should actually push it into your long-term memory. So even though you want less retrieval, you still obviously have to do flashcards. Even when you've done your mind maps, you still have to practice active recall, of course, but you shouldn't have to rely on it as much. So when you're doing encoding, when you're sort of pushing things into long-term memory through using mind maps, it can feel very uncomfortable the first time doing this, guys. It can feel quite confusing, and it takes time at first. The more you do it, the easier it gets, the better it gets, and the more you remember. Okay, so it will feel a bit unnatural the first time if you haven't done this before, but if you keep at it, if you keep practicing it, you will get better at it. So to do proper encoding, you need to do what's called higher order learning. And when it comes to higher order learning, this is what we're aiming for. We're going to look at a thing called Bloom's taxonomy. Now, this is, if I show you guys this is where a lot of teachers will probably feel a shudder going down their backs, because a lot of teachers have studied this before when it comes to doing their teacher training, their postgraduate certificate of education. So what is Bloom's taxonomy? Well, when we talk about taxonomies, guys, taxonomy is just a way of classifying or categorizing information, and it's usually hierarchical way of doing it. And who's Bloom? Well, Bloom is a guy called Benjamin Bloom. He came up with this idea in 1956. There was a sort of updated version from about 2001 onwards, but it's more or less the same. So that's the one that we're using here, is the more latest version of it. And he came up with a classification of educational learning objectives into levels of difficulty and complexity. He came up with a way of classifying these learning objectives. We'll go through each of them. When you create or produce a new original work, that is going to help you retain much more knowledge about that subject, because you have to do so much research and you have to pull ideas together and trace the discourse and come up with something new. That doesn't really apply too much to you guys at GCSE and A-level. I suppose for your compositions though it does, because you are kind of creating a new work in your compositions. So design, assemble, construct, conjecture, develop, formulate, author, investigate. That's the creation part. The next two you'll hopefully recognize that we've already kind of looked at is when you evaluate the information. When you try to justify a stand or a decision, when you appraise, argue, defend, judge, select, support, value, critique, and weigh. For me, the two that we're going to probably spend most of our time doing out of those, and they're all interrelated really, they're all synonymous with one another. When we make a judgment call about what is the most important information in your set work, that's part of evaluation. Or we make a value judgment as well. What is the most important thing, and what is the least importance in the set work? You're also doing evaluation there. So that's what we want to do. We're not so much create, because we're leaving that to the composition, but for studying your set works, this is the highest thing we could do. And the type of questions that will come out of that then are up here. So what are the most important features? Could be melodic, rhythmic, or harmonic features of this set work. Why are these the most important features? So you need to be able to, answer that question to yourself, or if your teacher was to ask you, why did you pick these 3 or 4 things as the most important musical features? You need to have good reasons for that. You can't just say, well, I just chose that for Handel it was descending sequences. Like, really? That was the most important thing? Not the fact that it's an SATB choir, or like there are 5 main themes, or it's a piece of Baroque music, or it's based on, it's from Handel's oratorio, The Messiah. Those tend to be like obviously bigger things than just, well, there's a descending sequence in bar 6. So you don't want that as your main feature if you can't defend it, if you can't say, well, there's a good reason why I've chosen this. So that's why we say, why are these the most important features? You need to be able to come up with good reasons for that. And then, of course, you can place them in order of importance. You prioritize them. And how do they compare to other set works? That's going to be a more higher order learning question to answer when you're comparing one set work to another. That will feature into our next thing we're going to look at here. So after evaluating, you should also think about analyzing your set works. Draw connections among ideas. In other words, differentiate or organize or relate or compare and contrast, distinguish, examine, experiment, question, test. So analyzing something. So for us, it's mostly going to be organizing and compare and contrast. And the type of questions they'll hopefully generate are something like this. How many distinct parts are there in this set work? How are these parts similar to each other? What's the relationship? So it could be different sections of a set work, or it could be this is theme A, this is theme B. How are they similar to each other? How do they influence each other? And that also could feed into this idea is how do they compare to other set works? Just like the order of importance did for the previous section we were looking at. How do they change? How do they change throughout a piece of music? So yeah, you may see theme A at the start of the piece, and then it may come back. So what's new? What's been added? What's been taken away? Has anything been added or taken away, or does it sound almost exactly the same? So for example, the theme A that comes back, how many times does it come back? How different is it each time it comes back? And is there a relationship that you can see for how it changes every single time? Then another section underneath analyzing. Applying is still pretty darn good, I think. Use information in new situations. So execute, implement, solve, use, demonstrate, interpret, operate, schedule, sketch. For you guys, that's probably just going to be using past papers. But also maybe when you're going into your past papers, including unfamiliar pieces that you haven't studied before. GCSE, AS and A2, all of them include almost an equal number of pieces of music that you've never seen before. So you need to be able to apply the information and the knowledge that you have learnt in your set works to completely unfamiliar pieces as well. So your revision is going to be good if you can apply that and practice, and in your study periods go through past papers and do this with unfamiliar pieces as well. So it's not just your set works. You should be able to apply this knowledge to completely new and unfamiliar pieces of music as well. So yeah, that's what you mean by applying your knowledge. The two at the bottom here, guys, when you're trying to revise, understand and remember, these are the worst. I've put red X's next to them. Explain ideas or concepts. Now, for some of you guys, this may seem very unusual that I'm going to sort of put down these ways of revising when you think, God, that's the way that everybody I know has revised this way. I've always revised this way. It's actually the worst way to try and remember things. And this is where a lot of students feel a lot of pressure coming up to exam time, because they are revising using these methods and they're finding them not effective. Or else the only way they are effective is that they have to keep at them for so long, revising 6-7 hours a day and then just burning out before the exam. You don't want to do that, obviously. You want to avoid that. So be very careful that you don't fall into the trap of applying these techniques to your revision. So when you're trying to understand something, explain ideas or concepts, classify, describe, discuss, explain, of course. Identify, locate, recognize, report, select, translate. Now, those aren't good ways of studying. And the worst of all is just trying to remember. And that's unfortunately where flashcards are, where you're just reading a question off a flashcard and just trying to remember an answer. Some things may need to be memorized, yes, of course, but don't over rely on this for your revision. You can't just memorize. For each set work, there may be like 200 or 300 individual pieces of information. You will not be able to memorize them all. You just won't, unless you've got an incredible memory. And because that's 200 or 300 things for each set work, times that by 10 or 12 depending on the board that you're doing and the level that you're at. If you're GCSE or A level, you're probably talking over 1,500 to 2,000 individual things to remember. You're not going to remember all of them, and that's just for music. Times that again by how many subjects you're doing at GCSE or A level. So yeah, just trying to remember stuff is not the way to approach your revision. Just simple recall facts and basic concepts like define, duplicate, or list, or just memorize, repeat, or state. So you can see here when you're trying to just understand or remember things, memorize things, this is just learning by rote. And it's, as Justin Sung, I think, said, it was mechanical habitual repetition. You're just parroting back information over and over and hoping that it'll just sink into your long-term memory. It's very difficult to do that. Information in this way is isolated, which is bad. Information should never be isolated. That's why I said before that when it comes to doing flashcards, you may need to do it once or twice, but don't do it like hundreds of times, because you should always try to bring information together with other information to help you remember them together. Okay, so never isolate your information. It feeds into this thing here. To engage with higher order learning and create more efficient encoding, putting this information into long-term memory, always try to relate information to each other and to those bigger picture questions that we were looking at earlier. Things that happen, I'll always try to say this every lesson from now on, things that happen over a long period of time, things that keep coming back, things that have dramatic one-off dramatic changes in the piece, or important structural features in the piece. Those are your 4 big picture things. I'll say them again. things that happen over a long period of time, things that keep coming back, dramatic one-off changes, and structural things like changes of key, cadences to introduce new sections, new themes or ideas that come in. Yeah, these levels, when you're trying to understand or remember things, they should come automatically if you're doing the higher order learning already. Like if you're doing evaluating and analysing and then applying what you've evaluated and analysed to a past paper, all this other stuff should automatically be included in these higher ways of learning. You shouldn't have to rely on just trying to remember or trying to understand. So get out of the habit of your revision of you just sitting there trying to always just remember everything. Get into a way of organising your information better, usually through mind maps, and you'll find that the memorization part of it will happen automatically. Your brain goes into autopilot. Yeah, that's what we say here. Your brain goes into autopilot. So for all the topics and musical features, if you're studying music, and all the things that you're writing in your revision, don't just think of them in terms of their relationships to each other, which is important. Do find those relationships because, as we keep saying, information does not like to be isolated. And don't just think of them in terms of a network as well, but try to think of them in terms of their position and strength within that network. So when you're doing a mind map, for example, anything that's more important than the other features, make it obviously more important in your mind map by highlighting it, put it in a bubble around it, make a different color, make it bold, make the font larger. If you're writing it by hand, that's really, really easy. Do something to that feature that makes it stand out on the page, that makes it easier to remember. And then you should be able to see what are the big ideas. Just by a quick glance of the mind map, you should be able to instantly see what the big picture ideas are for that mind map or for the set work. Okay, so think about the position and strength of the information that you're studying and the topics that you're covering. What are the most important features? Reordering is important. Information in books and in your set work is rarely presented the best way for learning. Yeah, so it's the best way for transmitting a large amount of information and recording a large amount of information for someone else to read through. But usually the way that information is presented to you in a textbook or in a musical score, that's very rarely the best way to remember it or to study it. So you need to come up with a way of reordering the information. And obviously, as I said before, I'll show you guys how I do this with some of the set works just to get you started. But if you do it yourselves, it's obviously going to be so much more valuable to you rather than just copying what I've done. Yeah, so think about reordering all that information in your mind map to make it a bit more memorable and to make everything in your revision relatable to each other, and to see those big picture ideas stand out. Like the most important ideas they should stand out. So think of your brain as a jigsaw puzzle, not a filing system. And then you've got to ask yourself, what are the most important pieces of that puzzle? Okay, the things that really stand out for you. Once you've got those, the surrounding detailed information should be easier to grasp and easier to maintain and easier to retain and for a longer period of time. So what's the problem with this then? Why doesn't everybody do this? Well, unfortunately, the higher up you go, the more engaging it is, yes, but the more challenging it is. I don't have to ask how many of you would, find doing your GCSE composition or your A-level composition, how hard that is. You all know how hard that is. And if you haven't done that yet, you're going to find out. It is quite challenging because there's a lot of engaging required. You really have to engage with the material and engage with your composition. So the higher you go up this pyramid, the more information, yes, you're going to be able to retain, and more retention you're going to have, but the harder it's going to be. And the further down you go, the less retention you're going to have. It's a passive way of studying, and it's easier, and it's also very boring because you have to keep going over it and over it and over it again and again and again. So yeah, that's the problem, guys, is that it is easier to do this, but it's not effective. I would say try to just ditch these two at the bottom. It's also very boring. Like, if anyone who's done flashcards will tell you that yeah, it's a novelty that wears off very quickly, that you've made maybe 30 or 40 flashcards, and then you go through them once or twice. You're like, okay, I'm getting this is good. And then after about a week or two or a month or two, you start getting very bored with your revision, if you weren't already bored to begin with. So it's not a good way to remember stuff if your brain just starts to switch off and gets bored. You're not really, engaging it enough. That's why it's challenging, and that's why we said over here that when you do efficient encoding or higher order learning by using analyzing and evaluating things, it will feel uncomfortable. It will feel confusing, and because it's challenging and it takes time the first time you do it, but you will save so much time in the long run. You really, really will. And I've seen students who their revision has been going through their textbook or their set work, and the worst thing you could do is just go through everything and start highlighting what you think of the main things, and then you read them and read them and read them and try to remember them, and you find you can't remember them, and then you change them into flashcards, and then you think, oh, this is a better way of doing it, and then you go through it again and again and again, and you're still not remembering it. And then when they finally start doing things like mind maps and thinking about evaluating all the information, and they think about analyzing that information, then they begin to understand that when you're revising, you should be revising. It's a revision, a new way of looking at something, a re-looking, if you think of it that way. So think of revising or revision. You're thinking of another way of looking at this. So if you're just rewriting it the same way that it was presented in the set work or in the textbook, you're just rewriting your class notes, and that's a complete waste of time, an absolute waste of time. And then making them into flashcards and going through the flashcards hundreds and hundreds of times, again, complete waste of time. If you make them into mind maps first and then quiz yourself on the flashcards, then you'll find that your retention is 100% better. It takes time to get there though, so don't be rushing your revision when you're doing it. Okay guys, so to sum up that section of encoding, what is encoding? Encoding is transferring information from short-term into long-term memory. Okay, having that information easily accessible and easy to recall, and having better retention of information. Okay, when you go through Bloom's taxonomy, you'll find that the highest order of learning to do this is evaluating, so making a judgment call about what are the most important things in your revision or in your set work or whatever you're studying. What are the main things that stand out and reasons why? Can you make a judgment call? Can you prioritize information from the highest, the most important, to the lowest, the least important? I would say for each set work, try to do like 3 or 4, maybe 5 at a push of the top 5 things for each set work. So that's evaluating. Then the next thing underneath that is analyzing. Compare and contrast. What are the similarities? What are the differences? How are things related to each other? How are they complete opposites of each other? Analyzing is always a very effective way for music of revising your set works. How are things related to each other? Like, how is theme A and theme B different to each other? What happens to theme A when it comes back later? So those are the main questions to sort of continuously ask yourself as you go through your revision and your set works. Then the one underneath that is applying your knowledge. So applying what you've learned in the evaluating stage and in the analyzing stage to real life scenarios or in an exam situation, demonstrating the knowledge that you have accumulated. And also, can you apply this new knowledge to unfamiliar pieces of music that you haven't seen before? So that's the application part. The 2 underneath that are the 2 that I want you guys to try and stay clear of, wean yourself off it or steer yourself out of it, which is just the understanding stage, and the one underneath that, the remembering stage. Okay, so understanding and remembering, it may sound really stupid to say this, but it's the worst way of trying to retain knowledge or trying to understand a topic or trying to memorize a topic. Even though you think, well, if I'm trying to memorize a topic, surely just sitting there and trying to go over it and memorize it's the best way. No, actually it isn't. You will remember it through things like analyzing it or evaluating it. It's the same thing as when you try to describe your favorite film. You don't sit there and try to remember every single detail. You'll actually describe it probably in terms of its structure, because without thinking about it, you have actually analyzed the film itself. You know, how did it start? How does it end? What happens in the middle? Is there any dramatic changes in the film? You know, any sort of plot twists, that type of thing. The names of the characters and how do they change their character arc, and then things like what's said in individual scenes, where the film's located, where each scene is located. So think about what your favorite film would be, and then if you tried to explain it to someone, what would be the first thing you would say? You'd probably say the title, who it's by, the major plot story behind it, and then when somebody asks you, okay, go into more detail about that, then you might describe the opening scenes and the characters involved and things. So you don't really just start at the detail and work your way up. You start at the top things, the most important things, and work your way down, always. Okay, so your revision should be like that as well. Start with the big topics, the big picture ideas first, and work your way down. So yeah, guys, when I'm doing mind maps for my students, these are the two big areas that I get them to focus in on: evaluation and analysis. And for music, it's going to be evaluating, making a judgment call. What are the most important features, and why, and what is the order of their importance, and the features to watch out for. Anything that happens over a long period of time, anything or any ideas that keep coming back, you're restating the same thing over and over again. Or number 3, one-off dramatic changes. Or number 4, the structure. So important key changes, important cadences, important introduction of new themes or motifs. Okay, so those are like the top 4 when it comes to evaluating. Once you have those, the second process should then kick in. Analyze what you've written or what you've studied there. Compare and contrast, find the similarities and details. What is their relationship? How do they influence each other? How do they change throughout a piece? And if you can keep all of those questions as you're studying your set work, you'll probably find that your revision is a lot more interesting and it's a lot more effective, because these are the things that you should always start with at the top. And keep it quite general, and then work your way down into the detail. Don't be tempted just to start your revision in bar 1, beat 1, and work your way through the set work bar after bar after bar. You're not going to remember much, if anything at all, and it's going to take a long time to do, and by the time you get to the end of the piece, you've probably forgotten what the start of it was anyway. Whereas if you go through the entire set work, not in order, you can jump around. Don't be afraid to like start in the middle or start at the end, start at the beginning if you want. But just go through it and find the big things, and they won't always be together, and they won't always be of equal importance. So you need to sort of go through and find those things for every set work, and then ask yourself these questions. Then when you have asked yourself these questions, you should create a mind map from that. Okay guys, that's our look at note-taking and what is encoding. So try to keep the idea of SQ3R, your survey, your questions, and then your read, recite, review. And also try to keep on the other side the idea of evaluating and analysing and applying that knowledge. Good idea, I think, to go through this video and make some of your own revision notes to practice, you know, taking up some of the big ideas and creating a mind map just from this video. So you'll find that if you do a mind map for this video and sort of study those topics we're looking at today, that your revision is going to speed up over time. The process of doing a mind map is going to speed up. Your retention also and your understanding of a set work will speed up, and hopefully it'll start making more sense as well. The more you apply the SQ3R and the more you apply evaluating and analyzing your set works. So that's what we're going to do over the next few videos, guys. Is the next couple of videos we're going to jump into mind maps and active recall and spaced repetition and some of the laws of mind mapping, and then maybe the final video is going to be flashcards. Okay, what is their use, what is their purpose? Please like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. And if you have any questions or you want to get in contact with me about anything at all, my contact details are in the description below, and I'll see you again next time.